So, dude, if you look here, the British clearly had them overwhelmed on the left, but no one actually attacked. So, on this side, they were completely exposed. So, obviously, they're going to overwhelm their left flank.
Right.
And so, if you look at it that way, the Battle of Waterloo really wasn't Napoleon's fault.
All right, well, we should probably start the video now.
We can just talk about this. Okay, so the Federal Reserve, what is it? Well, the Federal Reserve was kind of made to help banks transfer money between each other and kind of do it with a lot more ease, because before the Federal Reserve came to be, money was physically transferred between banks. But with the help of the Federal Reserve, they were able to transfer money electronically. So everything was done through a computer, where the money's not actually moving. It's just TD Bank tells Commerce Bank how much money's transferring between the two, and at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve just adds that up and keeps everything online.
Right.
And there's other parts to the Federal Reserve besides that, obviously.
Well, their history is actually, it sounds like a conspiracy theory because of how, like, just creepy and weird it is, but it basically started, it has there's a lot of events that lead up to the creation of the Federal Reserve, and in 1791, Alexander Hamilton basically started the thought of having a centralized bank.
Well, that's why he's considered the father of modern banking.
Exactly. But then 20 years later, we had a lot of problems with our centralized bank, and it kind of crashed, and we got rid of it. And then in 1816, we put forth a bill to basically reenact it, but and then that didn't go over too well either. So in 1907, we had a congressman pen up the first draft of the Federal Reserve Act, which failed. But in 1913, the bill was rehashed and passed by President Woodrow Wilson, basically before he even got into office, which is a little shady to me. But that's the story that the Federal Reserve wants you to believe. That it was an act of Congress. Yeah, pretty much. But in 1910...
On the Twilight Zone.
In 1910, four extremely wealthy bankers got together in Jekyll Island, which is an island right off the coast of Georgia.
Is that a federal entity? Is it
no? It was
just
a vacation home of J.P. Morgan.
Okay.
So J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Nathan Rothschild, they got together. So these four families basically owned 1/4 of the world's wealth. So if you think we have an income inequality problem now, look at back then. But yeah, I digress.
And they were tied into the government, so that makes it a little bit more scary.
So the actual act was drafted in this vacation home on Jekyll Island, and it was not. They want you to believe that it was penned by Congress, but it was not. And the Federal Reserve is privately owned. It is not a government. It is not owned by the government. It's private, and it's owned anonymously by anonymous shareholders. So we have no idea who actually owns it. But on their site, they say that it's not privately owned. It's owned by the people. But if it's owned by us, then we should be able to basically lower interest rates and all.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So,
well, another thing is the Federal Reserve claims that they aim for a 2% inflation over time. But I don't think that this is actually an accurate percentage of what's going on. But when you actually look at the interest, you see that it's compounding each month. So in reality, when the average is around 2, or actually slightly under, in reality, when it's compounding each month, the total percent increase is a lot higher.
Right. And, back to the history of the Federal Reserve, they had 5 objectives that these, 4 extremely wealthy bankers wanted to accomplish. And they were, 1, to stop growing competition from newer banks in the U.S.
Well, that sounds like a problem right there.
Yeah, well, it gets worse. 2 was to obtain a franchise to create money and make loans to banks. So basically to monopolize all the lending.
And antitrust laws do nothing to inhibit that?
I guess not. Why don't you explain antitrust law?
Well, an antitrust law is basically a law where you see it in most countries now, that discourage businesses from owning a complete monopoly on a certain type of entity. So say I was a cable provider and I owned every cable company, it would be broken up. And this is exactly what happened to Standard Oil, which was founded by John D. Rockefeller, because they gained a complete monopoly over American oil, and they wound up splitting into a ton of companies, including BP and a number of other American oil companies. So basically, they had Rockefeller was forced to sell off shares of his company and divide them between multiple businesses.
Due to
so
government legislation?
Yeah, so that he didn't have a complete monopoly. And usually we see this... usually the American people agree with this, but now when we see that when it's tied into government, no one's trying to stop it.
Right. And, back to their objectives. Number 3 is to control all banks and their reserves. So, basically what you were saying, yeah.
Where are antitrust laws?
And number 4 is to shift losses from banks to the taxpayer.
Wow.
And number 5 was for these guys to convince Congress of the purpose so that they can convince the people to stand behind it. And this honestly just infuriates me because the government can obtain loans from the Federal Reserve without permission of the taxpayer. So what's happening is we're no longer taking loans from China and foreign countries. We owe money to basically ourselves, like the Federal Reserve. And we're taking loans from the Fed, who is just printing money out of nothing. And that's what's causing all this inflation. And that's what's causing, food prices to go up and, rental and property. All these prices are going up due to inflation from the Federal Reserve because they're just printing money through quantitative easing, which is basically a fancy term for printing money.
And now, a lot of this does sound like a conspiracy theory, what we said earlier, but it's not like this is secret. They have released documentation. You can see here right on their website, we found a PDF of their 5 objectives, and it lists everything Dan just said.
So, and basically what the Fed is doing is they're making loans to the government, and the government is basically taxing us to pay back their interest. And this is, our Constitution prohibits any type of private company basically making up, coining our currency. But, this is illegal, what's going on now, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and a public, or a private entity controlling public growth.
And there's basically an unsaid agreement between the Federal Reserve and our government because the government is granting the Federal Reserve complete monopoly over our currency, and in return the government is getting loans at basically without having good credit.
And this is nothing new. We always see all the time. The government hates monopoly unless they have it.
Yes.
And that's what we discussed this in our net neutrality video, which if you haven't seen that, you can click right here. The government effectively is forming and forcing a monopoly on cable companies. Though there's multiple companies, they're all regulated, and these new government regulations are stopping competitors from entering.
Now, I don't want to get any more into a conspiracy, even though this isn't, but JFK was the last president to actually go up against the Federal Reserve, and he signed Executive Order 1110, and we actually had our own currency made by the federal government. Can you show them what?
Yeah, we have a comparison here between the Federal Reserve note, which we're showing now, and the United States note. And while they're the same picture and everything, you can see right here, everything's red and switched to green. And basically, how I understand this is they're trying to get off the Federal Reserve and trying to mint our own money, separate from the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, but keep in mind, these bankers, who we don't completely know, they have buco bucks, and they control all of our politicians and all.
And now was this soon before JFK was assassinated?
Right after this executive order was signed into law, 6 months later, he was shot.
Okay, let's back away because I don't like conspiracy theories.
So, and before we end, I'd like to go into a little history of Nathan Rothschild and how he acquired a lot of his money. Now, he was a German banker, and during the battle of during the Napoleonic Wars, he was funding. He wound up funding the Battle of Waterloo. He funded both sides, the French and the English.
Well, was it Smith & Wesson who sold guns to the Confederates and to the...
I think it might have been. But anyway, he was funding both sides of the war. And he had early word that the English won. But he told everybody in England that the French won, and he bought up a bunch of government bonds when they were dirt cheap.
Oh.
So he owned the government a ton of government bonds, and because he was lying to the bankers and to the government. And then when the actual news came out that the English won, government bonds, they skyrocketed in price, and he made a ton of money off of it. So that's Nathan Rothschild for you, and he was a leading voice in the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, you guys didn't think we could connect the Federal Reserve and Waterloo. Well, you were wrong. And now, an important thing to remember about the Federal Reserve is what we said earlier, that they're essentially disconnecting physical money from the value of a dollar, which is bringing us even farther away from the gold standard.
Well, that's why a lot of banks are pushing credit cards and debit cards now.
Exactly, and the Federal Reserve is working closely with the IMF, which produces this artificial currencies, the SDRs, the special drawing rights, which is money that doesn't exist anywhere, which allows the IMF to give aid to foreign nations on U.S. and other countries' dollar.
Right. Why don't you read a little more about the special drawing rights?
Well, the special drawing rights were created in the IMF around their inception, and it's basically a way to lure in other countries into or to keep them trapped in the IMF, because it allows countries like, say, the U.S. who give a lot of money to the Federal or to the
IMF,
the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF is able to rope in major nations like the U.S. into being indebted to them by allowing them to give a lot of the loans they're giving in foreign aid in the form of these special drawing rights, which is essentially just credit.
Right.
And when they're giving more than half of the money that they give to the IMF in this credit, then the they're roped into the IMF. The IMF gets to spend all the money they want and still have the U.S. indebted to them and every other nation. And it's just bringing us farther away from the gold standard and far away from a physical currency. And when you combine that with the Federal Reserve's inflation, you just see us moving farther and farther away from economic stability.
Yeah, and the fact that we're so globalized and tied into everyone's currency, it's scary, because we basically have countries that are too big to fail now. Just like, GM and all, two businesses that are too big to fail.
That's another thing the World Bank does, is they bail out nations.
Yeah, exactly. And
on the U.S.'s dollar.
And if something that happens like Greece, like this is a domino effect now. So like once Europe goes, or another large economy in Europe, we're screwed basically, because we rely heavily on those nations.
Yeah, and it's going to turn into a battle for economic stability. We can call it the Battle of Moneyloo.
Okay, that's not going to be in the video.